Let's go.
Hello. Hello and welcome. My name is Steve Kett, and I am the Chief New Product Officer of the Advisory Board for the Arts. The Advisory Board is a membership organization, and on the call today, there are a wide variety of members and guests from around the world. We are grateful to all of you for taking time away during this extraordinary moment to join the conversation. The topic for our conversation today is adapting strategy in uncertainty. And we are especially grateful to our two guests, David Bardolet, Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the Bocconi School of Management in Milan, and Edgar Dobie, Executive Producer and President of Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. Sincere thanks to both of you for joining us today. Let me do just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. First, if you have a question at any time during the conversation, please type it into the chat box that you will find either at the bottom center or top center of your screen, depending upon the view of Zoom that you're using. I'm joined today by my colleague Karen Freeman of our Advisory Board for the Arts research team, who will keep the Zoom trains running on time and keep track of your questions. Later in our discussion, Karen will ask our guests to respond to as many of those questions as time permits. In fact, to get comfortable using the chat box, please go ahead right now and enter your name and where you're joining us from today. Terrific. It appears we have a very high level of Zoom proficiency on the call today. And feel free, of course, to start entering your questions at any time. As we begin, we have everyone's audio muted. This is to keep our discussion moving smoothly, avoid folks talking over one another, and most importantly, allowing everyone to hear our guests clearly. Again, though, if you do have a question, please just type it into the chat box. And finally, I want to mention the launch of the Arts Resilience Center. The center is a major initiative by the Advisory Board for the Arts to provide immediate support and services to our members, as well as to the broader arts community during this time of unprecedented crisis. After we conclude today's conversation, you may want to visit our website, advisoryboardarts.com. There on our homepage, you will see a link to the Arts Resilience Center. The center contains a wide variety of resources, so please visit and take advantage of those resources. So let's get started. If I could ask David and Edgar to share a very quick snapshot of their backgrounds with us, that would be great. David, may I ask you to get us started?
Sure, Stephen. Hello everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I thank you very much, ABA, Chris, Stephen, for the invitation. I am a professor of strategy at SDA Bocconi in Milan. I joined the school 12 years ago. But in fact, right now I am based in Mumbai, India. I'm the dean. I'm a professor and a dean of the branch of the subsidiary of the Bocconi Business School in India. So for the past 2 years, I've been working in here. And even though Stephen mentioned before that I'm mostly a professor of strategy in the for-profit world, in the corporate world, I have had contact with the arts world through the management of a Master of Arts Management program that we do at Bocconi in Milan, teaching a group of students that are training to manage arts institutions. So I teach strategy to that group, and it's always a pleasure to interact with this world, with this sector.
Great, thank you very much, David. Edgar?
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for this opportunity. I grew up in Canada. My mother was the child of the Depression, and she used to say, "Misery loves company." I think I'd like to change that and coin the phrase, "Uncertainty loves company." So I'm very happy to have an opportunity to engage with the advisory group this way. I'm only ever worked in theater. I've always been on the administrative side of things, producing side of things. Had a life in both the public theater and in the commercial theater. And I, about 10 years ago, moved back into working in the public theater and at Arena Stage. We're a 70-year young institution that was at the pioneering end of a whole resident theater movement here in the United States. It's arguably our national theater. We have tremendous reach into the communities, and I was drawn to this whole field by the founding principles of the resident theater movement, which is that we connect in a very deep and significant way with our communities and the artists that live and work and rely on our facility to help them tell the stories that they have to tell. So we're storytellers.
Great. Well, thank you very much to both of you. If it's okay with you, Edgar, I'm going to ask you our first question. Our topic today is adapting strategy in uncertainty. And I tend to think of that just a little differently as making decisions in environments where variables are constantly changing or even unknown. And I saw recently McKinsey refer to it simply as strategy meets the coronavirus. So Edgar, with that said, and to get us started, would you kindly share a few specific large unknowns that you and your team are wrestling with at Arena Stage? Not decisions, we'll get to those a bit later,
Right.
but rather the unknowns surrounding those decisions.
Well, I mean, I think it's on everyone's mind right now. So this isn't peculiar to Arena Stage, but when to plan to be back. It doesn't feel good not to be producing live theater right now, and there's an overwhelming urge to get back. But we have to be guided in this particular circumstance. It's not like 9/11. It's not like the Great Recession. There are just so many other universal global issues to take into account. It's not entirely safe for us to bring our employees, artists, or patrons back at the moment. So there's a big question around that. And then we're also wrestling with how to come back, because we're getting enough feedback from our community to know that even though they love what they do and feel that we're a really necessary part of their lives, that the number one concern is their health and safety, as it should be. So that's a question of how we do that, and we're in a circumstance now where everything's fractured. Our revenue model's fractured, our programming model is fractured, our business model's fractured, and frankly, we're also trying to figure out if we that also extends to just our core mission. So those are the when and the how, and that big existential question of what will we be doing.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much, Edgar. David, let me turn to you. And as we've mentioned a couple of times now, your teaching and scholarship focuses primarily on the business world, but you did mention the arts management program at Bocconi. And that said, in the corporate world, in many instances, many industries face tremendous uncertainty all the time. The tech industry comes to mind, for example. And I know you've done a lot of thinking about uncertainty, as well as how companies can make better decisions in uncertain environments. When we spoke the other day, you mentioned the VUCA framework for thinking about uncertainty. Would you walk us through that idea right now?
Sure, Stephen. Let's talk about VUCA. Before I get into teasing out a little bit what that means, let me make a distinction. What we are all doing now in our companies is crisis management, is not strategy. And if the talk is about strategy in VUCA environments, which applies to in a more general sense to from now to years moving forward, it's about what we need to do today about the situation will be in 12 months, in 18 months, in 2 years. That is strategy under VUCA. What we're doing now, most of the time is crisis management. We are triaging, we're doing triage, we are fixing gaps. The insights that I hope we get in this conversation are more about planning for the mid-long term out of this situation. So let's tease out a little bit this framework, because I think many people, when they hear VUCA, and it's a term that has gained a lot of popularity, they simply take it as VUCA environment is a difficult environment. Right? It's an environment that's particularly messy to operate in. I think it's worth teasing out a little bit its components, because each one of these components sort of creates a different problem for an organization, creates a different need to do something about it. Right? And the way I like to think about it, of VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, is sort of from top to bottom, right? An increasing level of difficulty that gets added to the company. So if we start with the first point, and we are in a company that experiences volatility, that's simply we are in a sector, we are in a world in which some of the key business variables move quite a bit within a range. This range is more or less known. I mean, not exactly perfectly the limits of this range, but we know that one day we are in an up position, and in a few years or in a few months we'll be down. Okay? It's typical environments where oil prices, are one of the key business variables, where people's incomes in a particularly volatile economy in certain countries or in certain regions, right, might have an impact in the business. That is a situation in, again, lots of ups and downs the company experiences, not necessarily a lot of uncertainty in predicting what is going to happen next. The next level of difficulty is when we experience a really hardship in predicting key business variables. Right? That's a situation of uncertainty. When launching a new activity, when launching a new product, when we don't know exactly how the customer will react to the introduction of something by a competitor or by ourselves. The difficulty in gathering enough information to make those predictions, and the difficulty of turning that information into an accurate estimate. That's uncertainty. Right? And the problem is that many industries, as customers, right, as visitors, as consumers of any type of product, get more and more sophisticated, it becomes harder and harder to predict their behaviors. Their behaviors are moved by many more variables, and it becomes very difficult to come up with an accurate prediction of where they're going to go or what they're going to like. So that's the second level. The third level is complexity, and that is the previous two problems, volatility and uncertainty, multiplied n times, and multiplied because the company keeps growing. The company branches out into different types of customers, and their environment grows. So that makes it the problems of volatility and uncertainty much bigger. And finally, ambiguity. What it means, it's sort of the harder version of uncertainty. It is very related to uncertainty, but whereas in the first level of uncertainty, in the second point, it was hard to predict the sales or the visitor, because of the arts with our artists, etc., are going to be like. Right? So whereas before maybe we knew more or less the cause effect of things, who is in this model of reality, and who is not. When ambiguity gets added into an industry, then we just don't know. And it becomes very difficult in that situation, a situation of ambiguity, to interpret information, because every signal we see could mean different things, could mean that we're moving towards different types of worlds. So what companies need to do, and what companies that have been facing these kind of VUCA environments have been practicing and trying to develop capabilities to do this. Point number one, and it's very related to volatility, is to build organizational resilience and flexibility. If you're going to be in an environment with lots of ups and downs, it doesn't matter how well you predict them, you're going to be experiencing the downs. You need to build resistance to those downs. And companies, and tech companies are really good at this, for example, hoard cash in bad times. They know that their environment is volatile, that they'll need the cash when things go down, when they experience that volatility. So they start gathering more resources and saving them for other times. Or when they plan increases in capacity. If you are in an increasingly volatile environment, you have to be very careful, and this is something I think also applies in the arts world, in making increases in capacity, in number of seats, in venues, etc. If you're doing it at a moment where maybe it's a little bit of the mid-high point in your industry, because you will be planning a capacity that in bad times is going to give you a lot of trouble. Right? So there are different ways in building this kind of resilience and flexibility to support, to resist that volatility.
David?
On the point of, yes.
So I'm just wondering if we might just drill in a little bit more on uncertainty and talk specifically about scenario planning for just a moment. If we could just move to that right now.
Absolutely. So in the second point, what companies do is develop the ability to plan without a reliable prediction of the future. Right? We all are accustomed to planning for a certain future. And what companies in VUCA environments like high uncertainty experience is that they need to make decisions, as Jeff Bezos at Amazon says, they need to make decisions with 70% of the information. You cannot have 100% of the information that you would like to have to make that decision. So, if you don't have information, or the information that you have a prediction of where you're going to be when the plan that you're making will happen, you can make goals, quite simply. And that's where scenario planning comes in. Planning is a tool that's widely used. More than 60% of corporations
It looks like we've lost David here. I apologize. Edgar, I'm going to turn to you, if it's all right.
Sure.
Ask about scenario planning at arena stage. Obviously, this is something that everyone is busy trying to do right now in the world of the arts, to figure out plan A, B, and C, if you will. How are you using it right now at arena stage? What kinds of things are you doing there?
Well, we are definitely using the word scenario a lot in our daily usage of words. I appreciated David's point about that we are in a, almost simultaneously in a crisis management mode, as well as having to move past that and start in as transparent a way as possible with our boards and with our staff. We have to describe the scenarios. Looking at the slide that's up here, I wouldn't describe it as a hiccup, our scenario A, but our scenario A was that it was going to be dealt with in a fast way. the issue, and when that scenario was put together, and as we know, things change. Base case becomes best case, becomes worst case in a heartbeat in dealing with the situation. But we thought that we would be able to, in our best case scenario, be back up and running in July and be able to meet and keep our business model the same as it has been for the last 10 years. And that's have 10 shows that we could offer to the public on a subscription model. The second scenario was that this was going to take longer than that. We had kind of 4 triggers or markers that we were looking for. One was that our hospital capacity was going to actually get built up fast enough and immediately in order to deal not only with this first wave, but what might be next waves. The second is that testing would be ramped up to the point where we could actually figure out who's actually been exposed and has the ability to go back into the general population in a safe way. And of course, testing around just around who's got the virus as well, and then hopefully vaccine, because vaccine is the development of that, the availability of that is I think the way to build the most confidence around anyone wanting to come back and participate in a live theater event. So we didn't have 4 scenarios, we had 3. We're starting to develop a scenario B1, which is we're not going to be able to be back in the fall. We're going to have to be back in either that December or January period. And where this is really impacting us is the whole business model. We're not doing with a calendar like that. We're not doing full seasons, or what we used to describe as full seasons. That's 10 plays. We're looking at 6, and that has enormous impact on the revenue that's available. And we're coming right up against a problem that Arena has, and I think that maybe the performing arts field has as well. Is that we're slamming right into structural deficits that we have been as a field operating on a lot of sweat equity for years, and a lot of just keeping it all going so that there's a float that you can continue to operate on. In our case, it's our subscription float, and any kind of surpluses that we've been able to tuck away into inadequate reserves, certainly inadequate to deal with anything like this. So we're and also those big issues we're also looking at the smaller issues that you kind of ignore within your institution because there's room to duck and dive around certain issues, and now there's a lot less of that space available. So we're having to fold a lot of things into that second scenario in terms of just how we operate and what the play choices will be. The third one that we've looked at is that nobody's going to feel comfortable until there's a vaccine. So our board has asked us to look at just shutting down. Let's look at a scenario where we shut down for 2021 season and come back when we can come back with a community that's confident that it's okay to gather again. So we're looking at all of those. We haven't made a decision around any of them, but we have. Well, that's the approach that we took. We knew that we immediately had to move into that kind of scenario planning, which for my theater colleagues on the phone will know that we always start with, it's just like season planning. We start with a calendar, right? We pick a point and try to work towards that first performance when we can welcome people. The feedback that we've been getting from the surveys that are available in the DMV anyway is that social distancing is going to have a really significant impact on the capacity in our theaters if our patrons are looking for a seat between them. if they're looking at wanting to know that they're gathering with other people who don't have the virus, the idea of having to take temperatures and have washroom attendants and have good housekeeping seals of approval on the wall that you have been that this building has had a deep cleaning every day. And we're starting to see a little bit of pushback from just the artists that we rely on to come back and do the work. Certainly, we heard recently from the Actors Union that they're going to want to know that we're providing safe and workplaces for their members before they're prepared to let us re-engage them. So, a multitude of things going on, but hanging on to three, not four scenarios. I suppose the big disruption, slow recovery, and lingering effects are more what we've been working towards.
Thank you, Edgar. And I know that
Sorry, Stephen, I got cut.
we lost you, and now you're back. And what Edgar has been talking about is what everyone on the call is thinking about is the variables around reopening. And the scenarios that they've been working with at Arena Stage to try to figure that out. So, David,
if I can add, I was listening to Edgar. He was describing very much how scenario planning should be done. And noting that he was talking about three scenarios. That's perfectly fine, right? I mean, there are four in here because sort of you play with two variables and you intersect them and so on. But the number of scenarios in a good scenario planning exercise is not that critical. You have to create enough scenarios that you cover all the plausible scenarios, not all the likely ones. Probability doesn't matter in here, but all the possible, plausible ones. And I made this four because for me, I mean, as we're talking, and I saw a really good blog post in your website about the three scenarios moving forward, etc. But one important thing is to consider if this disruption lasts long enough, what more fundamental changes will happen in the industry. And if those fundamental changes happen, right, so the model of the industry changes enough, then we're not in a situation where we need to plan for the reopening of our traditional business with some more restricted measures. We are in a scenario where we need a new business model. And in particular, what happens if customers it's not that they come back, it's that they really like what is being offered online. Because now we are offering things online just to cover the gap. But what happens when a good chunk of customers really enjoy that and become sort of online customers, or at least they don't come back with the same frequency? That's a permanent change. Right? It's a fundamental change that you need to adapt to with your business model. So that's a sort of a more longer term scenario that I think companies now need to be looking a lot at the reopening, but also look a little bit longer in what might be that fundamental change. Right? On a second point, and going over this sort of what things to do, you need to stress test your strategy against each scenario. That's a thing that maybe companies build very nice scenarios, but then they don't spend enough time really saying, what are our revenues in this scenario? What are our costs? And what is our situation in each one of them? Because from that exercise, from that second point, looking at your strategy in each one of these possible scenarios, you identify point number 3, and this is, I think, very important to make scenario planning actually a tool that leads to decisions. Identify 3 types of actions, right? The no regrets actions, the options, and the big bets, and especially the first 2. What is a no regret action? A no regret action is something that you can do today that's going to work quite well in most or all of the scenarios in the future. There are things like this. Right? Lego did this exercise at some point because they were thinking about entering Asia, and they discovered that developing a certain capability worked well no matter what. So that's the thing that you can decide right away, right? And you might be paralyzed of what do we do now if we don't have enough information. Well, there are things that you can do that because they will work well, and you've seen that in your scenario exercise, you should do right away. It's different from the options. The options are more actions that work well only in one or two of the scenarios, but don't work so well in the others. So what you want to do is not commit right away today to doing that. You want to gain the right to do it later. You want to invest a little bit into that. Do a little bit of an initiative or of a project into that. So then as you read more of the situation, as you get more indicators about which scenario seems to be the one that is about to happen, you can then expand that option. You can invest more, right? So many companies, when they are looking at investing in a very risky environment, they invest with an outsource, with a partnership, right? Less risk. And they gain knowledge, they gain sort of a foothold into that environment. And then if they see that, yeah, that is the scenario that we're going, where this project, this investment, this initiative makes a lot of sense, they invest more heavily into it. Right? The big bets are the ones that work very well in one scenario, but work terribly in the others. So you have to be very sure to make those. So I think by identifying these sort of no regrets options, there are companies that you can. A big example of a no regret option is the investment in digital that all the arts organizations are making. Right? You can see that as a sort of a stopgap, as a measure to sort of recover a little bit the lost revenues. But you can also see as something that's going to work no matter what is the scenario in the future. Because if the scenario is more traditional model, what we've been doing so far, the digital environment will still give you some additional growth and will allow you to reach audiences that maybe were not there before. But if the scenario really moves to a big disruption, it might be the dominant business model. Or it might be a business model that you need to play with no matter what, if you want to survive. So making that investment is a typical no regret type of move.
Got it.
Obviously, the fourth point, very, very quickly, you need to set some indicators. Now we are all looking now at the stock market. We're looking at medical variables to see which scenario will turn out, right? So you need to identify, put it in a little bit of a dashboard, and check it regularly to say, okay, it's number 3 or it's number 2.
Terrific. Thank you very much, David, for going through that. I understand from Karen that there are some good questions coming in from folks that are listening. So let's turn to a couple of those right now, and then we'll sort of step back in. Karen, do you want to direct one of the questions you've received?
Sure, yeah. There was a question, I think it relates to what you just said, David, which is, how do you decide the timeline to move forward when you're not getting a lot of guidance from authorities? And I think maybe that gets to that question, that point you just made around key indicators or warning signals for when to move forward. So I guess I'll aim the question at you, Edgar, which is, do you have some sense of which are the triggers that you use to decide between these various scenarios? And if you, and then David, maybe you can add on some other thoughts you might have for this.
I mean, what's been governing our actions so far are the public health authorities, the CDC and the DC Department of Health, and the sheltering in place and the social distancing guidelines. Now, some of them are voluntary, but we ignore them at our peril, and they came in waves, as everybody. Well, they certainly did in the district anyway. We were, first 1,000 seats, and then 500 seats, then 250 seats, and then during the intermission of the show that we were opening in our 220-seat theater, we got a directive that we couldn't gather more than 10 people in the district from the high-risk category group, which a lot of our audience members are a part of. So there's that, and then there's part of what is involved in those stress tests is we rely on an earned and a contributed model to pay the bills. And in the old days, that was a month ago, that was, if we're going to spend $1 on a program, 70 cents of it was earned and 30 cents of it came from a contributed source. That's with the revenue drying up, that's putting a huge emphasis on our contributed side. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of work going on in trying to shore up our finances so that we have the resources to come back and meet the obligations of coming back. So resources, and then our enterprises are finally in the hands of trustees, and so how they're feeling about the enterprise in the future is really important as well. And our board happens to be very engaged in that. So higher authorities like federal governments, health authorities, our own kind of resources to make decisions, and a very engaged governing body is how we will make those decisions.
I agree very much. I would just add one thing. The situation in different countries in the world is not synchronous. So we might have the advantages in certain countries to look at cases that are a little bit ahead, that they went through the curve and they are moving towards a back to normality kind of situation. And we can study those cases to understand a little bit what are the timelines. In terms of being able to do it, obviously, there's just the government saying when. In terms of when and how we might really recover some sense of normality in those activities, I think it pays to look at these indicators of what's going on in other countries.
Yeah, it's a very good point.
Really helpful. There's a set of questions actually that people have been asking in the chat around risk and liability. So with some concerns about people getting sick when there is a performance, how are you thinking, Edgar, or how have you discussed with the board? Any discussions about risk or waiver signing was a question that kind of came along. Any considerations that you've placed about the increased risk of people getting sick when they're in your spaces?
Listen, I think we have to be prepared for that going forward. I don't. Our invitation would never ever involve having someone to sign a risk or take on the risk of actually accepting our invitation to come and see a show or buy a ticket to see a show. We have a lot of work to do with our facilities if the health authorities are going to be saying that you have to take everyone's temperature. That already poses a problem, because how do you do that and not get within 6 feet of someone? In our case, we have 1,400 volunteer ushers that are the first people to normally greet. We may have to be rethinking whether those greeters have to be professionally trained, not volunteers. In order to do that, and then just how our spaces are laid out. We have 3 theaters, and if you impose that seat restriction that people are looking for, our 200-seat theater becomes a 125-seat theater. Our 500-seat theater becomes a 300-seat theater, and our 700-seat theater becomes a 410-seat theater. So it's huge impact, and they have to be set up so that I guess you can clean your own seat. I mean, we're hearing all of this. We're hearing it from the airlines, we're hearing it from restaurants that are having to do the social distancing. So it really does affect how much you can do and the scale of what you can do. But we do know, I think the thing that's top of my mind is that we have to create a safe environment, or no one's going to want to come back to work or to enjoy what it is that we put on our stages.
So I'm going to jump in with a question, and this is to both of you at this point. I know there are some other questions too, Karen, that have come in through the chat room that I can see as well that I want to get back to here in a minute. But the question I have is, obviously, this is an enormous existential kind of threat to so many arts organizations, because, David, when you're talking about, for example, flexibility, hoarding cash during good times, and then you're sort of you've kept that when times are not as good. The arts world obviously has, as you mentioned, Edgar, operates with much less wiggle room. most of the time.
Yeah.
So this is obviously an existential threat. But given that, to what extent do you think it may also present an opportunity? That is, does this moment present an opportunity, for example, to re-examine long-held assumptions about our business model, about our operations, about how we reach and engage our audiences, on and on? Edgar, let me start with you. What are your thoughts about this as a moment to really embrace and look for a very different solution out of it?
Well, you know, I think perforce this is that kind of opportunity. Just looking, I said this earlier. We're just looking at how we're organized as a management and as a staff to respond and to look at making decisions and how we actually truly do take resiliency as one of those goals, one of those core values, if you will. So this is an opportunity to look at mission and to look at your core values and revisit those at the same time as we're doing these scenario planning. And you know, one of our trustees did say, look, whatever plan you come up with, I'm going to want it to relate to what we understand the values of this institution and an enterprise to be. So certainly that fundamental conversation is going to have to happen. We were, as an institution, I think it's fair to say is that we were just in step, not ahead of the game with the whole digital strategy. I don't mean we still always want to be delivering live performances, but can we augment that experience? And can we reach people who leave because they're just, you know, can you maintain those relationships in a different way? I think is something that we're looking at. And it's funny when we had to do a reduction in force immediately, and we had to furlough 75% of our staff, and often it wasn't just based on seniority; it was actually based on that individual's flexibility to engage in other areas that they otherwise wouldn't normally be involved in. And so you were looking for folks that weren't frozen in their tracks or just wanting it to be the way that was always been, because it's not going to be that anymore. So it's so we're in and around digital and connecting that way using we tend to use words to market, and we're having to use imagery much more, video and connecting that way with all of our audience in order to market the show and explain what it is that we're up to. So we should probably be investing more in building that kind of facility and capacity. And you know, and then there are just some straight inefficiencies that you, as I mentioned earlier, you turned a blind eye to because the show must go on and it's kind of working, and there's always room to carry or ignore a problem, we're moving to a space where that's not going to be possible anymore.
David, how about your thoughts on this as a moment for reflection, maybe an opportunity to really radically rethink things? I know in the corporate world, there are many examples of organizations that have faced very dire circumstances and come out stronger on the other side. What are your thoughts about this as perhaps an opportunity?
Absolutely. An old professor of mine, Richard Rumelt, is a strategy professor, likes to say that every time there is a big structural break, it's the time when companies and countries, for that matter, have to do less of A and more of B. A being what we've been doing so far. B, we don't know what it is. That's the problem. But in these moments, it's the time when companies are forced to experiment and try to find what B is. If we can jump to the last slide. There is a view of strategy of these complicated plans from the top to the bottom, that looking at the future and trying to predict it and building a beautiful plan. But more and more companies that are experiencing these high levels of uncertainty and ambiguity, their strategy process is becoming more like the one in the bottom. It's about identifying a portfolio of new initiatives, of new things that might make sense for the company to try, and then test them, experiment, right? We are now in a situation, I think, where this experimentation is forced. Our organizations, just to recover some of the losses and stay in business, are forced to try things. Ideally, you would do this also in good times, but doesn't matter. If we are forced to do it, that is the opportunity right now to do little market tests of these key initiatives and then measure the results, learn, and if the experiment looks good, grow it, scale it up. Maybe it will become a dominant business model for your company in a few months or years. And if it doesn't, then change it a little bit or abandon it completely. That is a strategy process right now for many companies, right? We are forced to do it, but the important thing is, since we are forced to do it, is that anything that you're doing right now, gather the learning. Because a lot of the experiments that we're doing in a forced way right now, we're just trying to survive. We're just trying to do something that might bring some people back. Try to structure it a little bit, I would say. Try to structure it as an experiment where there are two key variables that you want to measure and see if you are doing better in that in that type of initiative. Right? There's a nice article about the San Francisco Opera and something they tried that illustrates very well this process of creating very cheap experiments that are designed and run in a matter of hours. And they are thrown out there in the market. You're gathering the inputs from the customers, and you keep iterating this process until you have something that you can launch and that can become something valuable for your organization, right? So this is a process that is very much, I think, worth exploring in these times, and absolutely taking advantage of the opportunities. The big innovations and the big that usually come from outside, from entrepreneurs, happen in these times.
Right. You know, one of the examples for us has been how agile our education and community engagement department have been at adapting to delivering virtual programs. One of them is a devised theater program that moved from being, in the classroom to online, and they moved from doing a live festival to creating a film of the work that has been created remotely, and that led them to say, maybe we're probably going to have to not do a summer camp this year because parents won't feel comfortable physically sending their kids. So they've adapted very quickly to and have modeled doing that online as well. So it's the caution that we've had around just delivering the core programs that we do as well, and education is core to what we do. But the plays is that the urge is to give it away for free, and we actually don't want to make that mistake that the newspaper industry made back when the web arrived, where suddenly all of the content was free and online. So I think we're trying to be a bit more cautious about how we distribute plays digitally in that way, and of course many of the artists involved in that have collective agreements, and they're sort of putting on the brakes as well. So, but it was interesting to see that it was in that education space where, when you've got all these kids being homeschooled, suddenly that there was a huge appetite, and we're able to respond fairly in a fairly agile way.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good example. I following up on this, I want to insist that it's a great opportunity because these experiments are always at a small scale. And because they are at a small scale, they don't scare our stakeholders. Mm-hmm. The crazy thing should be done at a small scale. There is a company right now in China, a big media producer, they make movies, Chinese Chinese movies. In 24 hours, they decided, because people cannot go to the movie theaters right now in China for these past months. In 24 hours, back in January, they decided to release their big movies on TikTok. This platform, this Chinese platform that is now all the rage. That is, TikTok is about short videos, right? So they started talking with this TikTok owner. So we want to release our long movies into your platform because that's where we can do it. That's where the audience is, and let's try it. So they're not going to move their business to TikTok anytime soon, but they release one movie and they learn. And based on that learning, then maybe in the future, this kind of release will make sense for them in some shape or form. So the importance of doing it small, so not to scare anyone, not to break your business model right away, and to measure the results.
Terrific.
Good.
So let me, I know we've got a couple more questions that have come in. I'm seeing them roll in here on the chat screen. So I know I have my favorites, but Karen, I'll ask you for maybe one or two more from the folks that are listening in, because I've seen so many good questions come across.
Yeah, I think we've addressed many of them, including talking about live streaming, supporting a viable business model. I guess there's a few more specific questions that came in earlier around, Edgar, when you talked about your earlier scenarios, when you talked about shutting down, how are you thinking about the people? And specifically, I know you mentioned you had to furlough 75% of your people. Are you in that shutting down scenario? Are you thinking, the question was, does that involve furloughing all staff for that period of time and then rehiring? Or do you retain some people? How do you think about people in that scenario?
We announced that initially an initial furlough through to the end of May, and we were in a position to give our staff 4 weeks notice on that, 4 weeks paid notice on that, and then we were able to make the commitment that their health. We worked out with our health insurance provider that even though they were furloughed, that we could continue their health coverage through to the end of the calendar year, which was a great comfort to everyone. And then we worked very, very closely with the Department of Employment, and in order to make it as easy as possible to actually get those benefits that were in place, including the top up from the federal CARES program. We were, and that was all part of a plan to get to the summer and to be producing our production of Tony Stone. Our production actually was created at ACT and a co-production. We very quickly turned around our PPP application and got and actually filed that on a Sunday and had the money in the account the following Saturday morning. So we were one of the ones that worked well with our bankers, and that turned around very quickly. But we're now looking at how we use that to get to, in our scenario planning, part of it's building a budget and then understanding you've got a cash flow program underneath it to get there. So, if we have to take the decision to be producing a smaller season, we will not be in a position to call all of those people back. It's heartbreaking because they are all hugely talented. They're the team we needed in place across all areas of support, the production, marketing, business office, all of that. Everyone was affected. And it's devastating to have to dismantle that wonderful group of folks during that period. So we're as an institution, 70% of our budget goes into human resource and artists, and so it's been deeply impacted. I appreciate the question. It's not. It was not an easy thing to do, and Molly and I and 4 other members of senior staff contacted each one of those individuals that were furloughed and a direct conversation with them. So again, hard to do because we were all working remotely.
David, I know you may have some additional thoughts on just how to factor in some of these people decisions. You know, right before the coronavirus hit, I think everybody was talking about shortage of talent and specialization of talent, making talent shortages more of a challenge. How should people be thinking about talent decisions as they are factoring into strategy?
Sorry, I didn't get very much the question. I couldn't
Oh,
hear
just
well.
how should people be thinking about the talent part of this strategy decision? It's not a place where you can do a lot of sort of testing and learning, but talent can be hard to find, especially specialized talent.
Certainly, and especially for company. I mean, this is your strategy that's all about the resources that you keep in the company and that you develop, right? That are give you really an edge, that give you the ability to reach your audiences. But as Edgar was saying, I mean, there's going to be hard decisions to be made here for sure, right? Here, the part is to identify that the best advice I guess I could give is, as much as this is a step that we don't like to take, there's got to be an understanding of what kind of human resources are core to delivering our mission, and what kind of human resources are maybe a little bit of slack, inefficient slack that built over time. What kind of resources maybe can be shared with other partners, platforms, ecosystems, and make that distinction so we can really invest and make the effort to keep the core part of our people, right? That we cannot do without. That if we lose them, then our business cannot happen.
So I'm going to take this moment as we're approaching the top of the hour here to thank you so much, David and Edgar, for taking this time to speak with us today. We very much appreciate it, as I'm sure everyone on this call does. So thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
Just a quick note, by joining today, everyone on the call will receive a summary of today's discussion, as well as notification of future webinars in our ABA Live series. This is an ongoing series, with our next webinar occurring 2 days from now on Thursday, April 23rd, focusing on fundraising for the arts in Europe during the coronavirus crisis. By the way, if you'd like others to receive these notifications, please email register@advisoryarts.com, the address you see here. And finally, the Advisory Board for the Arts is a membership organization. And while we're making several resources available to non-members during the crisis, we offer a much broader array of research and services to our members. So if you're interested in finding out more about what we do and how we might support your organization, feel free to let us know right now. You'll find my personal email address in the chat box. Please just click on it and send me a note. I would be delighted to speak with you. You'll now see a closing polling question. We want to get your feedback on this webinar. So thank you very much for taking a moment to share your thoughts. We will hold the poll open here, but again, very sincere thanks to Edgar and David for joining us today, and for everyone on this call. Please be well, please stay safe, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.